So again, I want to welcome everyone to the Grand Canyon Historical Society virtual outing for December 10, 2024. And tonight we have part two of what is now going to be a three-part author talk presentation by Grand Canyon Historical Society member and author Mike Nelson. The book that Mike is presenting and is describing is the one shown on the left. The book is We Are Going In: The Story of the 1956 Grand Canyon Midair Collision. So, the Grand Canyon Historical Society, this is our mission statement. The Grand Canyon Historical Society celebrates and promotes the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. We are celebrating 40 years as an organization this year, and please see the summer 2024 issue of the Old Pioneer magazine for an article by former presidents, GCHS presidents Dick Brown and Al Richmond, and former board member Steve Verkamp about the formation and the early history of the society. If you like what you see tonight or in previous webinars, please consider becoming, if you aren't already a member, please become a member. The dues are only $35 per year. We're an all-volunteer organization, and if you like what you see, just go to the website, to the membership page. It is working. It wasn't working for a few days earlier last week, but it's working now. The dues support our activities, which are research grants and funding of worthy historians. It also funds our social media presence, our activities such as tonight's outing, our Zoom function, and it funds our annual awards ceremonies, which we celebrate in the midsummer meeting, at the midsummer meeting and picnic. It also includes the dues also pay for the publication. And again, while it's all volunteer, there are costs associated with publishing such a fine magazine as the Old Pioneer, which includes the bulletin. That's more or less a newsletter portion, events and upcoming activities, book reviews. The Old Pioneer, I've added the current issue is the one on the left. That's the fall issue, and it's really interesting. Is a very interesting article about bird watching and birding in bird studies at Grand Canyon and the San Francisco mountain region, mostly discussing Torrey Bradford, who actually lived where I live in Santa Barbara. He lived here for many years and also pursued his bird watching activities here in coastal California. So virtual outings, tours, Grand Canyon history, it can all be found at our website. It's all virtual, of course, at that location. We have these virtual outings, but we also have physical outings, which we announce. Some of them are last minute, some of them we plan months in advance. But again, make that website, bookmark it, make it a regular place to visit. We also have recordings, the one we're recording right now. We have the Zoom recorded and then we post it at our Vimeo platform. And all those are available at the website. We also conduct oral history interviews. We facilitate them. Several people conduct them, but we facilitate oral histories for those with a story to share, with some being part of history of this region. And here's an example of myself interviewing Don Ranney. Don's the father of one of our board members, and Wayne Ranney. And Don worked at the Los Angeles International Airport in June of 1956 as a trainee with the predecessor to the FAA. It was called the Civil Aeronautics Administration. And he was a trainee on the day when these two aircrafts, which Mike's going to discuss in his author talk. These two aircrafts took off and crashed over the Desert View portion, the eastern portion of Grand Canyon. So if you know of someone who would like to participate in an oral history interview, please let us know. It's very simple, very easily facilitated at the website. There's an email address. We are trying to recruit additional individuals with whom we'd like to speak and have them share their historical perspectives. Also, if you like the idea of presenting your own historic research, if you've written a book, you've written articles, you've presented at other forums, and you have an idea for a presentation, be it a virtual outing like this or an actual outing, as we did this summer at the Apex, Arizona archaeological site near Tucson, then again, drop an email, outings@grandcanyonhistory.org. All of your emails are read. We have this email system, which is part of our website. And all of the individuals in the board do receive some of those emails, and some of us receive them all. So they are read and responded to. So the next outing, our next virtual outing will be, believe it or not, in the second Tuesday of January 2025. Okay, it's coming up. So Davy Crockett is our speaker at that outing, and Davy is now a board member elect. He was elected in our board. He received the board membership. He'll be inducted in I guess we don't use an induction process. We just have the individuals take their positions on the board on January the 11th, 2025. So he'll be a board member the time for his talk. So he's an author, historian, ultra runner, and he is going to present stories based on his book, Grand Canyon Rim to Rim History. Here's a photo of a class. There was a school for the blind students in Williams, and this is a class. They actually hiked the canyon with their professor. He was training them using cords and various ways for them to stay connected to each other. And it promises to be a very exciting and very interesting and engaging talk that Davey will present.
That's cool.
We'll look forward to that. And we'll have more about that talk on our website as we get closer to January the 14th. So tonight we want to welcome back Mike Nelson and Barbara Nelson, who's there operating the computer at his end. This has actually now become a three-part series. It was supposed to be two parts, but we've decided, Mike presented and offered to the virtual outing, the outing team, to expand it to 3 webinars. And there's just so much content to present, so much research. The last one in October was extremely engaging, very well received. I'm sure tonight's will be equally engaging, insightful, but this is part 2. Part 2 will take us from the Midair collision event through the crashes, because there were 2 separate crashes. They both crashed after that Midair collision. Will take us through those pinnacle events, and then the third part of the webinar will take us beyond the crashes into the recovery, the memorials, and then the present time with the families and patrons group. So that is the description of the part 2 and part 3. I'm going to read this, so you can read it yourself, but I'm going to read it just to go through the biography. So Mike will present part 2 of a detailed synopsis of what happened based on his 10 years of research and analysis, the latter being a tremendous amount of both interviews and mathematical reasoning. He spent an average of about 20 hours a week working on this over the course of a 10-year period. Mike will present part 3 of this author talk right now we say mid-2025. We're tentatively going for April, and it would be the second Tuesday of April, which is actually the 8th. His academic background in physics and mathematics has served Mike well in this aviation accident research. Mike became associated with the Grand Canyon Historical Society in July 2014 when he gave a speech at the dedication of the crash sites as a National Historic Landmark. I'm going to add what's not written here. I was at the family's dedication, which was on June 30th of 2014. Mike was not at that particular event. He was at the public dedication, and his speech is actually online. If you search for it, it's on YouTube. I actually didn't meet Mike until June 30th, 2016. Met Mike and Barbara on June 30th, 2016, when we had a families meeting for the that time. Hard to believe that it was the 60th commemoration. But in 2016, Mike co-founded Patrons of the 1956 Grand Canyon Midair collision and became the group's president. Barbara is the secretary, and I'm honored to be the vice president of that group. The Patrons is an affiliate of the Grand Canyon Historical Society, and the mission of the group is to uncover and to preserve the history of this tragedy and its victims, and secondarily, though still very important, to chronicle the stories of what family, sorry folks, there we go, what family members went through at the time and how the disaster changed their lives. So I don't mention it here, but Mike lost his uncle on the United flight, and I lost my father. So we both have a unique perspective that we bring to the group, and we do have many family members in this group. So we bring a real personal touch to the story of this crash, which can be analyzed very, in a very analytical way, in a very sterile way. But at the end of the day, it was an event which touched not just 120 souls that lost their lives, but all the families. We think we've calculated there's probably well over 1,000 individuals that were closely associated with this event. So with that introduction, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to invite the Nelsons to start sharing, both visually and verbally.
Okay.
Now we have to sit on pins and needles to see this. We can pull this off. But Barbara, you should be able to share because you're a co-host, and just go back to what we practiced before the webinar started. Nice. Take it away, Mike and Barbara.
Okay. Well, she's already operating, so I'll start. I'm Mike Nelson, as Tom told you. I'm the author of a book entitled We Are Going In, which is a very detailed and heartfelt history of the Midair collision on June 30th, 1956, which involved two of the largest airliners of their day, which both were so damaged by the collision that they couldn't fly, and they crashed at the far eastern end of the Grand Canyon. Just a quick reiteration of what I discussed in the first part of this lecture 2 months ago, to help refresh the memories of those who tuned in, and to offer a sketch of background to those of you who did not. So can we have this? Oh, you got it already. Man, you're efficient. On that terrible day, a United Airlines DC-7 with 58 persons aboard and a TWA L1049 Constellation with 70 persons aboard took off from Los Angeles International Airport just 3 minutes apart, both headed approximately east-northeast, as you can see in this diagram, which shows their courses, or their intended courses. United was going to Chicago, and TWA was headed to Kansas City. It's interesting that when they left Los Angeles, TWA was north of United, and then they crisscrossed at the Painted Desert, so that from there for the rest of the trip, United was north of TWA. And I'm not sure why they did that, and I never pursued that question because it seems so minor. Let's see here. They left only 3 minutes apart. I think I already said that. Due to last minute maintenance, TWA was hung up in the hangar for nearly half an hour. They were almost half an hour late getting going. But the captain was very resourceful, and he employed 3 time-saving strategies, reducing how late he would have been in Kansas City to only 10 minutes if he had made it there, which I think is amazing. TWA took off first, and then United right after, 3 minutes later. Being the faster plane, though, by about 30 miles per hour, the United DC-7 would have passed the TWA plane well before reaching the accident area, even with the normal 15-minute lag between them at Los Angeles, let alone with only an unusually brief 3-minute gap. But the measures taken by Captain Gandy, the captain of the TWA flight, to save time, had increased his speed to only a couple miles per hour less than United's. Normally, as I said, the TWA plane was about 30 miles per hour slower. Let's see, can we have, oh, you did it. Man, you're on the ball. Thanks. Where was I? Oh, because of his greatly increased speed, TWA's, that forestalled United catching up for quite a while. And from one perspective, that is what enabled the two of them to meet where they did, instead of United being way in the lead by then. No one survived. All 128 persons on those 2 planes, which included a baby 4 weeks old, all the way up to an elderly gentleman, 83 years old, perished. They all lost their lives near the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers. Finally, as part of this little introduction, in part 1, I took the story up to the point where I thought I had given a good explanation of why United 718 did not see TWA2. I'd like to just pick up from there with sort of an antithesis. I have not found one shred of evidence to use as a basis for attempting to reason out why TWA did not see United. In straight flight, the Constellation crew could have seen the DC-7 off to the right perfectly well from either pilot's seat, captain or co-pilot. So how did both pilots fail to see the onrushing DC-7? This, for lack of any evidence and pending any finally surfacing, this is probably anyone's guess. And I'll give you mine. Distraction. I picture First Officer Rittner, the co-pilot on TWA, dropping the ember of his cigarette down in between himself and his seat and having to rush to unbuckle and stand up to contend with whatever was resultantly burning, the upholstery and or his slacks. Naturally, he would have been paying no attention to what was going on outside the window to the right while contending with his little minor emergency. And by standing, he would have been right in the way of Captain Gandy seeing what was going on out the right-hand windows to the right. In other words, he would have prevented Captain Gandy from seeing the DC-7 also. The same would hold, I would think, if First Officer Rittner had spilled scalding hot coffee on himself. It's only natural to get up and try to do something about whatever's happening at that time. And both of these errors are not unlikely. I mean, everybody smoked on those planes. Everybody drank coffee. So anyway, that's my best guess as it stands now. I can't feature this crisis taking more than 30 seconds to resolve, though. So what I'm really saying is that the TWA crew lost at most 30 seconds of viewing the DC-7, the United airplane, which was a pretty big chunk of what they had. Once both planes passed the clouds, which I'm going to describe in a minute using this chart that's up there, they only had about a minute to spot each other and get out of each other's way. So losing half a minute would be quite substantial. Anyway, where was I? I'm talking so much impromptu that I'm losing my place in the actual typed out document. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Sorry about the talking to myself. I believe that TWA2 lost enough time, whether through my suggestions or something else, so that when they resumed normal flying, they saw the DC-7, but it was too late. No, not yet. I want to talk for a moment about those clouds. This is a view, just a crude drawing of a giant cloud that was centered over Grand Canyon Village at the time of the collision. It probably measured about 20 miles north to south. It was a cumulonimbus cloud and growing and really big. The first drawing depicts what would have happened if only that giant cloud had been there and no other circumstances different from that. The distance, as you can see from points A to B, which is the distance across which they would have been able to first see each other, is really quite great if you look at from A to B in the other two drawings. So they would have had quite a lot of time comparatively. In the second drawing, the cloud has an unusual spiked feature. It's sort of like a knife edge, but it would have been very tall, many miles, but still drawn to a point. If they had had to fly around a feature like that, the distance from A to B again would have been greatly reduced, giving them a lot less time to spot each other. And the same goes for the third drawing at the bottom. If there had been a second smaller cloud at the northeast or near the northeast quadrant of the big one, and the two planes followed the same courses that they did in the second drawing, they would have had only the distance from A to B, or the time it would take for that, to spot each other, which isn't much. And I have uncovered a lot of evidence to the effect that there probably was that second cloud hiding behind the giant one. I'll go into that in another lecture, or another segment, I mean. Can we have the next slide? Thanks. This drawing depicts the manner in which the two planes came together. This would be at the very first instant of contact, before they had even done any damage, the exact instant at which they touched. I've shown United tilted. Naturally, this is a view from directly above. United's tilted, which you can tell by looking at the tail, in order to perform a right-hand turn. It's banked. TWA, you can't tell from the drawing, but it's my contention that they were ascending very rapidly at an angle of about 10 degrees to try to heave themselves over United. In other words, they did see the United plane. but a fraction of a second too late. I mean, look where that wing is of the United plane in relation to the whole structure of the TWA plane. It just barely hit it at the rear end. It's just, it's unbelievable. I'll get into that in a minute. The whole collision sequence took only about 1/10 of a second for those two planes to hit each other and crisscross and do great damage to each other. Took 1/10 of a second because they were going so fast. And the faster their forward speeds were, the greater the rate at which they closed side to side on each other. You know, the gap from one plane to the next to the other in a direct straight line was shrinking as they progressed. That rate was really quite tremendous. Let's see. I'll just say they came together in a V, which you can pretty much tell from the drawing. And on the other side of that, after the collision point, they would have been diverging from each other in an inverted V, or in simpler terms, their flight paths described a huge X as seen from above. I envision DC-7's wings so seriously damaging the Constellation's fuselage that the normal aerodynamic loads on the Constellation's huge 50-foot wide tail section overstressed any still intact structural members, and they gave out, letting the whole tail and a little of the fuselage in front of it tear off. Still, things happened so fast that to an observer, had there been one, it would have appeared that the United DC-7's wing cut off the Constellation's tail. There are many, many stories that say that that's what happens, but it doesn't really fit well with the evidence. It's more like, well, here, the left wing of the DC-7, the United plane, did not meet the top of the Constellation's fuselage on edge, like a knife to cut through it. It met it flat and like a belly flop, and basically slapped the whole upper right side of the Constellation at the rear. Two planes crushed each other, but did not literally sever each other. Let's see. Sorry for the delay. I already pretty much said that. Find my next page. Without its tail section, the Constellation went completely out of control. The TWA plane, the one on the left, it was no longer flying in any sense. It was falling, and that's all. There was nothing back there to make the plane climb or descend or turn. And the loss of the tail's weight seriously unbalanced the plane. The center of gravity immediately jumped forward of the center of lift when the tail came off, and the two normally coincided, leaving no net rotational force tending to raise or lower the nose, which is to say simply that the plane was normally balanced. With the center of lift acting like a fulcrum, the now nose-heavy plane pitched into a nosedive. Yeah, that's the one we want. Thanks. As the plane continued pitching, nose down, it steadily sped up in this motion, with the nose steadily presenting itself more to the airstream as it fell toward pointing straight down. It encountered a relative wind that quickly grew from nearly zero to over 100 miles per hour, probably adding its own impetus to the rotational momentum that the plane already had. Basically, the Constellation tumbled repeatedly end over end as it came to the ground. It landed flat on its back, upside down, with the nose area pointing roughly back in the direction from which the plane had come. I've imagined this 100 times, and it is just too horrible to really envision. I mean, can any of us imagine the terror and the extreme trauma of those poor people on that plane? Probably none of them, except for the flight crew, were strapped in. I mean, this was the cruising phase where they could get up and move about freely. They would have been thrown around like the number balls in a lottery cage inside that fuselage as the plane tumbled. Just horrible. Sheer madness must have almost immediately prevailed amongst them. And thank God for that if it did. They could not have grasped what was happening to them whatsoever. The DC-7 was still flying to an extent, but not an extent sufficient to keep it dependably up in the air or to more than clumsily partially control it. With the loss of so much of its left wing, and correspondingly quite a lot of the lift on the left side, it banked markedly left wing down and entered a leftward turning spiral descent. First Officer Harms, who again was flying the plane solo, and I'll say again, he was the co-pilot, was in probably the most frenzied yet contrarily collected effort of his life, trying to find a combination of control settings that would at least remedially give him back a measure of control, if not restore the plane to flying level and not banked. The DC-7 was falling, which may be hard to visualize because the wings were still producing lift, tending to keep it up in the air, opposing gravity. But the DC-7 was descending along the path it was following, and that was a descent that the pilot could not stop. He couldn't reduce it or end it. And so it was involuntary descent, and I call that falling. A couple seconds before the end, the DC-7's own tail came apart. The elevators and the horizontal stabilizers tore off, probably due to excessive airspeed or to damage inflicted on them by the flying debris in the collision, or both. All four pieces were found on the opposite side of the promontory that the plane hit, indicating that they had come off at a higher altitude than the crash site, high enough that they were able to sail over it rather than enter the fray. So topographical, yep. The DC-7 was found to have hit the promontory at an angle of about 25 degrees nose down. And this, combined with the fact that the tail had evidently come apart not far above the crash site, based on the proximity of its four horizontal members, indicated that the plane had been flying level or nearly level until the tail came apart. 25 degrees nose down is not terribly steep for a plane that had just a couple seconds before lost its tail. 25. Looking at this from the other side, the plane hadn't had more than a couple seconds to pitch nose downward, or the angle would have been a lot steeper. 25 really wasn't steep. It was significant, but not steep. And those couple seconds were enough that the plane must have been flying significantly higher than the elevation of the ridge that it hit, consistent with the lost tail components having the altitude to be thrown over the promontory. The failure of the tail is what caused the plane to pitch nose downward, and most directly to crash, similar to what happened to the Constellation. The failure of the tail was the event that ended everyone's lives. Further proof that the tail components tore off at a significantly higher altitude than the crash site was that they were found clean. Had they come off just as the plane crashed, they would have been singed and somewhat sooty from passing through the fireball, which erupted just a split second before they would have gotten there. But on the other hand, they were found near enough to the main impact site that they must have come off only a couple seconds before the crash. All of this happened very rapidly in very, very quick sequence. All the evidence hangs together here. It looks like First Officer Harms had performed the miracle of finding a combination of control settings to be able to actually fly the plane, rather than being taken for a ride by it that could only slightly and primarily uselessly be influenced by him. This is his plane. This is a United Airlines DC-7. With the loss of the outboard 20 feet of the left wing came the loss of the DC-7's left aileron. An aileron was a long, narrow flap hinged to the rear edge of the wing, which could be raised or lowered as a major component of turning. There were ailerons on both sides, out at the ends of the wings, which functioned in unison, but oppositely. To turn right, the right aileron had to be raised into the airstream to push the right wing down, and the left aileron had to be lowered into the airstream to push the left wing up. To turn left, the opposite needed to be done. After the collision, the left wing of the DC-7 was down, irrespective of the ailerons, for lack of enough balancing lift on that side. The wings, of course, produced the lift force, and with about 30% of the left wing missing, it was producing seriously deficient lift. So it was drooping down. The plane was tipping left wing downwards. To have any hope of leveling the plane and thereby stopping the spiral turn, Harms would have had to raise the right aileron to its limit. If he could have, he surely did. The problem with that was it's like every contingency is tragically covered here. The problem with that was that the ailerons were linked to each other with cables so that they would operate together. And when the left one tore off the plane, the cables that controlled it may have become jammed, not just severed. If they were jammed, it is likely that the right aileron was jammed and unusable. Jeez. But on the hopeful side, Harms must have tried to make the plane head toward a right turn. There is evidence that he not only tried to do this, but succeeded. Through assessing gouges and scrapes on the rocky face of the promontory, investigators determined that the plane crashed right wing down. Harms must have found that combination of control settings that gave him back a measure of coordinated flying. I'm guessing that part of this combination was manipulating the plane in ways that were never done. Some unique, bizarre collection of moves. The river wrapped around the promontory, or more precisely, the whole butte that the promontory was part of, counterclockwise as approached from the south, which is where the DC-7 was coming from. Why would the co-pilot have wanted to turn right when the river and the channel through which it flowed and through which the DC-7 could conceivably have flown turned left in its upstream circuit around Chuar Butte? I have an answer for that. And I'm sorry to say, but I have a good reason to leave that out for now. I hope you'll trust me on that point. I do apologize if this disappoints anyone or strikes anyone as unfair. I am going to come out with that later, though. It seems that they came extremely close to surviving, which is incredibly frustrating. But how close really? No matter how incredible a job Harms may have done, it is nearly beyond doubt that they still could not climb, which left them only the option of landing on the Colorado River. The tail had to come apart when it did, and wishing it had held out until the plane started skimming the surface of the water, entails wishing a lot more than that the tail had held together. Harms would have faced a conflict of imperatives. Not knowing where deadly obstructions like boulders under the surface might be, he would have been compelled to descend to the river fast so as to minimize how far he would have to coast along it before coming to a stop. On the other hand, it would have been essential for him to minimize how hard he would hit the water in order to minimize how much further damage the impact might do to his plane. In other words, it would have been imperative for him to hit the water slowly. My guess is that he would have taken a compromise had he gotten that far. I'm just examining basically the hopelessness of this, looking at this hypothetical stuff to solidify the fact that this whole thing had to happen. It couldn't be avoided. Let's see. He could have mitigated how hard the plane would hit the water by slowing down before he touched down, say as by reducing engine power, or so it would on first glance seem. Here we go with the contingencies again. The trouble with this proposal is that his meager lift force was proportional to his speed. So in slowing the plane, the rate at which gravity was dropping it would have increased, tending oppositely to make it hit the water harder. Putting the two together, Harms could probably have done little to decrease the touchdown impact, unless he could have pulled up in the last seconds. But one of the terms in this hypothetical situation is that he could not climb, which is precisely what pulling up means. It looks like whatever fate had in mind, it covered everything. In all likelihood, there never was anything that Harms could have done to keep the DC-7 from crashing, even before he lost the horizontal structures on both sides of the tail. And once the tail came apart, the outcome was definitely irreversibly decided. But after that, it was absolutely hopeless. Chuar Butte is situated right at the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers on the west side. Like most buttes, from high above it, say like 30,000 or 40,000 feet in a jet, it appears to have roughly the shape of an amoeba, with its irregularly sized and shaped pseudopods encircling its central mass at odd intervals. These so-called legs are analogous to the promontories that radiate from the central mass of the butte. One of the promontories of Chuar Butte points directly at the confluence, and it is this one that United 718 hit. What we're looking at here is, my God, this is United 718. That's an airplane. When we go back to the other one, here's a United Airlines DC-7, a beautiful, graceful machine. No, let's do, and that is a United Airlines DC-7. Just beyond belief. I cannot fathom how an airplane could be that totally destroyed, but it was. United 718 crashed in a gully feature on the southern side of the promontory at the far eastern end of it, barely 10 feet down from its crest. This very small distance frustrates a lot of people, especially surviving family members and descendants, because it seems that United 718 was only a hair's breadth from overflying the promontory rather than crashing on it. But having that 10 feet by itself wouldn't have saved the persons aboard, nor would hitting the promontory 100 feet down from its crest have been any worse. And overflying the promontory, missing it altogether, would not have been any better. It just didn't make any difference because they would also have had to keep their tail. Where does one draw the line between supposing things that did not happen and facing reality? I ask myself this question frequently. Are there really two or more ways that an event can unfold, or is reality predetermined? I do tend to believe that whatever has already happened in the only way it could have, at least insofar as the universe upholds the laws of physics. Once the tail lost its integrity, United 718 was doomed to crash. Absolutely no way around it. And to crash utterly catastrophically with no hope of a belly landing, because they were in a nosedive that they could never have pulled out of without the absent elevators. The gully was essentially a vertical ditch extending very steeply about 200 feet downward from its crest to its terminus, at an apron that nearly leveled out before spilling over the edge of the cliff. After the gully, anything that rolled or slid over its edge would fall another 450 feet to the talus slope below. And just as sort of a parenthetic explanation, promontories were generally skirted by sloped pilings of rubble that had broken off and fallen through the ages and had accumulated in the only shape they could, the probabilistic shape of a cone. This rock pile was called the talus slope. At the very top, the gully was only moderately sloped, but that rapidly changed to nearly vertical across a very short span. In fact, at one point, the gully sloped beyond the vertical, cutting under itself. Because it hit an immovable, nearly immutable rock surface, the DC-7 had to take the full brunt of the crash. And in so doing, it basically disintegrated, which this picture blatantly shows. It shredded into many thousands of small pieces. And this one's hard to say, but I think I can say it without disturbing anybody too much. The people on board were subjected to a cloud of this shrapnel at a speed of at least 350 miles per hour. From the crew back to the passengers in the lounge in succession, all in the span of 1/5 of a second. The fuel tanks in the wings exploded at about the middle of that 1/5 of a second, and the resulting huge fireball immediately added its own destructiveness to what was already far beyond fatal. Yeah, that's it. This is Chuar Butte's promontory that the United DC-7 hit. That very dark band around the middle, but a little higher up on the right, is the Colorado River. The sloped area near the bottom of the photo is the talus slope. And then where the plane crashed is very near the top of the photo at the left, where there's darkness and silver. The darkness is soot, and the silver is aluminum, which was the primary ingredient of the airplane. And you can see falling down the ridge, there's more and more pieces of the airplane, all the way down to the talus slope at the bottom. If you can see, there's let's see, 2, 4, 7 pieces at least of the DC-7 down there where Barbara's circling. I hope you folks can see that arrow moving around. Let's see. Wreckage, and I'm sorry to say, another shocking reality. Also, people cascaded down the gully. Most of the junk that magnificent airplane had become lodged in the gully at all heights down it and on its apron. Many people, thankfully no longer alive, lodged in the gully too, especially at the bottom. Few pieces of wreckage vaulted over the ridge to fall down the opposite side, and many sailed over the edge of the apron at the bottom of the gully and fell the rest of the way down to the talus, as we were just attempting to show you. This photo, by the way, was taken very shortly after the accident. But anyway, only 4 people escaped the worst rending and the furious fire. Captain Shirley and 3 passengers. He was alone on the ridge, and the 3 passengers had fallen to the talus slope. Again, not alive, thank God. No one could have survived the initial unyielding impact at 350 miles per hour. The scene at the TWA site was much the same. Here's the Constellation, a beautiful, graceful airplane. I mean, I've never seen a more beautiful airplane than that. And then let's show the next one.
You're not there yet.
That is also the TWA Constellation. That's what that magnificent thing turned into. That beautiful plane became that. And one of the investigators I talked to, when he came upon the scene of the TWA wreckage, which is what you're looking at now, in a helicopter, he couldn't believe that an airplane could be that totally destroyed. And that was in his thoughts. In his words, what he said to his fellow flyers was, "Where's the rest of it? Like, this can't possibly be all there is. There's nothing here." But anyway, what I wrote here was, if the Constellation could have been put through some fantastic gargantuan blender and shredded to bits, the result would have been very much like the actual wreckage. The plane also instantly exploded, and a great and terrible fire raged all around most of the wreckage. And again, I'm sorry to be shocking the people on board, but I'll say it again, they weren't alive. Some parts of the plane bounced quite a distance, like the rubber-tired landing gear, and the tail was found, ruined of course, but substantially intact, about a third of a mile to the north, having followed its own independent path to the ground. But nearly all of the wreckage was concentrated in one huge haphazard pile. The plane had no horizontal momentum anymore like the DC-7 did, and also no extremely steep ground under it to cause its fragments to disperse widely like they did with the United plane. The Constellation had come to Earth nearly straight down in an area only mildly sloped. Coming up on the last little bit here. There we go. One thing that I do want to confirm again and make perfectly plain is that thankfully no one on either plane had lived for even a second during or after the crashes. If the word impossible had any meaning at all, that was impossible. By far the worst civil aviation accident that had ever occurred anywhere in the world had just happened. That concludes part 2 of my talk, and I'll hope that you return for part 3. The date for that hasn't been set yet, but we will notify you. And thank you very much for attending today's program. I hope you found it enriching or interesting or of value in some manner. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And the date is tentatively, and this is not fixed, but April 8th is the second Tuesday in April. April starts on a Tuesday this year, so, or next year. So that's the tentative date. Of course, we're going to announce it well in advance. But thank you, Mike, for this very deep and very analytical, I hate to use the word dive, this analytical investigation of the details of the two crashes. One of the questions that we have a few questions as well as many compliments, but we have one question which I know you'll want to answer right away.
Okay.
So Scott asked, if Harms was the one flying at the time of the collision, where was the actual captain? That's a good one for you, Mike. I know it was in your first lecture, but go ahead and give a quick answer to that.
I've given that quite a lot of thought and analysis, and obviously he was in the back somewhere and not in the cockpit. I believe that he was approximately at the buffet, which is what they called their kitchen, which straddled the entryway near the rear of the plane. And that when people would have been looking out the windows and seeing the TWA constellation coming, and that would have caused more and more alarm, fear, commotion, noise. And so I'm sure the captain slipped out of the buffet up into the area where the passengers were to see what the heck was going on. And he must have looked out the window and seen the TWA plane coming. But too much was thrown in his way in the aisle by the impact of the collision and by the tilt of the plane for him to ever crawl his way back to the cockpit, or so I believe. How's that for an answer?
Fantastic. I mean, it was covered in the first lecture, and it was one of the great findings of your investigation that if anyone takes away any information from these lectures, both Mike's as well as the ones I've given, is that Shirley was not in the cockpit. And the fact is that his body was found above the crash site, literally above it on that little, as you showed in the photo, in that top of the promontory. And for that to happen, the door had to pop out. He almost had to have like an ejection seat type of action where he was popped out of the aircraft. I actually you and I have discussed the idea of the, Miracle on the Hudson type of landing, but your explanation that it was really faithfully and physically impossible for that to happen kind of settles that. But there's one observation you and I have discussed, and I put it into comments to everyone. Harms was not the most experienced pilot or he was a co-pilot. He was not the most experienced aviator on this particular route of LA to Chicago. And he may not have known from his lack of experience the exact course of the Colorado River upstream from Chuar Butte. We all know it because we've seen the aerial photographs. We've all followed this, that it's a very long straightaway that goes off to the kind of to the left of Chuar Butte above the little Colorado River confluence. So he didn't know that, whereas Shirley would have known it.
Well, I agree with you to a point, Tom, except for this. The DC-7, Harms's plane, was still descending. It would have been downward a little. And he was sitting in the front, looking out the front windows. He could have seen miles worth of the Colorado River stretched out in front of him.
The co-pilot's on the right side, Mike. Yeah. He might have seen it, but he was also pretty occupied with the fact there was the crash the midair collision had occurred, and there was the clouds that we don't know. You may have this in your book, but there might have been clouds blocking some of that straightaway view. But it's clear that without the pilot, they needed the pilot, the co-pilot, and Fiore, the engineer, all working at peak rational logic in a space of 30 seconds to do anything that could have changed the outcome.
That's true. It's all the chance they had, except for the fact that, like I said, the tail had to come apart because it was damaged.
Yes, I wrote those notes down because although it's discussed in your book, I tend to forget how critically damaged the DC-7 became.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to stop the recording and try to do that right now.